The heat at the coastal forward operating zone did not rise, it clung. It settled into the folds of uniforms, soaked into the linings of boots, and made the air under the tents feel thick and lived in. A row of cargo pallets leaned against the far fence, canvas buckling under the humidity. Near the far edge of the landing pad, Reese stepped down from the rear of a utility truck and adjusted her gloves. Her flight suit was already dust-streaked from the gravel convoy lane. No one looked up. The makeshift compound sat wedged between the jungle and the sea, a flat grid of crushed coral and temporary shelters. On paper, it was a staging point. In practice, it was a bottleneck where teams stacked on each other waiting for green lights and air corridors. The SEALs were already on site, standing in a loose half-circle around the forward map table. Listening to a man who didn't introduce himself read timings off a clipboard. His words came fast and clipped, full of familiar abbreviations and assumptions. He never said Reese's name. She stayed at the edge, a half step behind her gunner, who stood silent and still beside her. His helmet was tucked under one arm, visor clean, expression unreadable. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The operations tent wasn't meant for pilots. It wasn't hostile. Exactly. But it wasn't a space built for them either. The buzz of radios blended with overlapping voices as officers shifted positions and updated terrain overlays. One large screen showed the mangrove inlet in infrared layers, bright heat lines where nothing could land, only hover. A small red circle blinked where the SEAL team's sabotage mission would conclude. It was deep in the foliage, more than 100.0 meters from any usable landing zone. No one addressed the question of how they would get out. They assumed the boats would wait. They assumed everything would go fast. "Extract routes tight," the man at the table said. He was broad-shouldered, overconfident, and marked his place on the map with a thick finger. "Boats wait at holding line Charlie. We go fast and wet. No delay." One of the comms techs asked about cover fire. A younger officer suggested a fast-rope Black Hawk team as contingency. The man shook his head. "No air insert. Too dense. Only bird in play is the Apache." He waved a hand dismissively toward the outer edge, not looking at her. "She'll fly scarecrow cover. Noise only." Reese didn't blink. Someone chuckled near the battery crates. Another voice added, "Too big to land anyway. Might as well be a billboard." Her gunner shifted slightly, enough to mark that he'd heard it. Reese's fingers moved to the edge of her kneeboard. She opened a laminated chart tucked into the lower sleeve pocket and ran her thumb along a hand-drawn tidal line. She didn't speak. She didn't raise her head. The notes she had scrawled the night before timing bands, wind corridors, and adjusted drift paths rested exactly where she left them. Her pen had pressed hard into the paper. The ink had bled slightly from sweat. At the table, the man snapped the clipboard shut and tapped the satellite phone at his hip. "Any deviation on evac. We break east and regroup at fallback delta. Boats wait 5, not 10, not 8. 5. Someone asked about the inlet depth. He replied it was close enough. Reese glanced at the second page of her chart, where she had calculated the rise to 1.6 meters by the end of the window. Close wasn't going to cut it. The briefing dissolved into radio checks and gear calls. The SEALs moved off without looking her way. One of the officers brushed past her with a nod meant for someone else. The younger pilots around the outer tent glanced toward the Apache, its rotors still tied and tail visible through the canvas gap. Its fuselage was streaked in dust and oil. Someone murmured, "She brought that here." No wonder Command didn't assign landing coordinates. She stepped outside. Her boots crunched on gravel as she moved toward the bird. Her gunner matched her pace without words. They paused 10 meters from the Apache. The sound of distant insects swelled under the canopy, a steady drone beneath the layered engine whines from somewhere inland. Reese didn't speak as she reached the forward skid, knelt once to brush a twig from the intake, and rested a hand briefly against the panel. The metal was warm, sun-soaked. Her tide chart was still tucked into her sleeve. Her gloves were still clean. No one had given her a time block. No one had to. The first light over the mangrove inlet didn't break, it seeped. It moved through mist in long, horizontal sheets, filtering down through canopy gaps and settling like vapor against the side of the Apache. Reese stood just beneath the wing root, tightening the harness strap across her shoulder as the turbine began to spool. Fog curled around her boots and spilled across the skid beneath the belly of the aircraft. Nothing above the tree line was visible yet, only gray light and the suggestion of motion. Her gunner moved, checking the chain feed manually and tapping twice on the FLIR mount before stepping back. He slid the cockpit ladder into position and climbed in first. Reese followed, her gloves smudged from handling the pre-flight latches. The air inside the cabin was warmer than outside, heavy with the smell of fuel and metal. No one had radioed. No one needed to. The SEAL team was already deep in the compound. Their exfil clock had started. The Apache lifted smooth and low, climbing enough to clear the crest of the inlet ridge before tilting nose down toward the eastern tree line. Rotor wash scattered the fog in spirals. Reese eased the collective, hovering steady between two bands of canopy where no one could see from below and no one from command would think to check from above. Her gunner adjusted the thermal overlay. He spoke quietly. SEALs are active. Movement near grid. 16 Delta. Reese toggled her secondary channel. The voice that came through was clipped and close range. Sabotage complete. 2 minutes to converge. Hostiles already aware. She adjusted trim, then tapped the edge of her kneeboard. The map clipped there was hand-marked in 3 layers of pencil and red ink. One of the bands showed mangrove thickness. Another marked probable enemy gun pit angles. The last traced a projected corridor line, not a road, not a trail. Just open geometry waiting to be revealed. The gunner leaned forward slightly. They won't make it through that tree line. Not without cutting east and circling wide. Reese replied without looking up. They don't have time. The RHIB channel came up, fuzzed by range. Waiting at holding line, Charlie. No sight line. No lane. Say again, no lane to shore. Reese traced the corridor line again with her gloved thumb. She had drawn it from satellite slope maps 3 days earlier, after reviewing how flood erosion had changed the inlet banks post-monsoon. It wasn't open yet, but it could be. What's the blast radius, the gunner asked. She didn't look up. Enough if we cut it in one line. The Hellfires were armed but not warmed. She flicked the switch to spool targeting. The display pulsed once, then locked. Through the canopy, the trees looked solid and still. But Reese could see the path beneath the bark, the way the mangroves narrowed near the high points. How the roots lifted where water ran strongest. The corridor wasn't theory. It was buried structure. She called in, request fire window, grid 16 Delta, 3-round ripple, target canopy saturation, depth 500 meters. The line stayed quiet for 2 full seconds. Then a voice replied, sharp and hesitant. Confirm fire request, Reese. Those are live markers. You'll collapse the corridor. She answered, only if I miss. Static crackled. Another voice layered over the channel. That inlet isn't rated for flight clearance. You're too close to RHIB range. Wait for eyes on. She glanced at the timer. They won't wait. The gunner ran a quick reticle check, winds holding. No drift. You're clean for ripple. Reese nodded once and locked the targeting line. The canopy below had no breaks, no signs of movement, but she could see it the way one line split the pressure band where the foliage bent inward from tide and terrain. A single cut would shear it open. Lasing, she said. Her thumb rested on the fire control. She waited half a breath longer, until the SEAL team's signal blinked once in the upper left of the display. Then she fired. Below them, the jungle canopy seemed to pulse with breath. The fog softened its texture, but Reese read the vertical density like a chart, noting where the roots gave way to silt flats, where the trees leaned east from last month's storms. She had seen the same shape in her overlays. And again, in the hand-drawn margin notes she copied from a survey map that no one had cleared for aircrew review. But she had kept it anyway. Her gunner tracked a pair of heat blooms to the west. Could be a scout line. If they push south, they'll cut off the SEALs by the waterline. Reese adjusted yaw slightly. banking to widen her sweep arc without raising elevation. The Apache skimmed above the canopy. The blades whispered. There was no radar ping. She wasn't flying by doctrine. She was flying by feel. Command came back on the channel, trying to reassert control. Negative on strike authorization. Wait for confirmation from boat team. Hold position and observe. Her gunner reached forward to reset the laser designator, arms steady despite the tension in the air. We're not observing. We're unlocking. Reese looked at the canopy edge, where the mangroves bent inward at a line only she had seen. She tapped the tide mark on her kneeboard with the back of her pen. The corridor wouldn't last. Chain set to standby, her gunner said. The warning tone for unconfirmed ordnance pulsed in her earpiece. She silenced it. Reese's hand hovered once more over the fire control, steady as the canopy rippled below. Then she squeezed the release. The first hellfire dropped clean through the fog and struck just above root level. There was no flash visible from altitude, just a muffled concussive thump as bark and silt erupted in a pressure wave that folded the lower mangrove trunks inward like torn cloth. Two more followed in ripple, staggered by half-second delays. The corridor opened like a pulled seam, wide enough for foot movement but not wide enough to feel safe. That was the point. The gunner marked 3 new heat returns west of the blast line and swung the turret toward the tree edge. He didn't speak. Reese adjusted altitude by touch, keeping her skids level with the broken canopy edge. No higher. From below came the clipped burst of SEAL team comms. Movement confirmed. Visual on the breach. Going now. Branches snapped as boots hit dirt. Reese tracked them in the periphery of her targeting scope, moving fast through broken terrain. Already, the corridor was refilling with smoke and hanging debris. She rotated to adjust and preloaded a second pattern. A voice on the water called out, "Ribes moving. Line still blocked at the mouth. Give us 5. The gunner scanned the inlet entrance. Too shallow on the south side. If they clip left, they'll run aground. Hold them 2 seconds, Reese said. Then mark me a 6-shot lane down center mass. Incoming spike, he said, possible man padlock from the northeast ridge. The warning tone followed. Reese saw the shimmer of heat just beyond a collapsed tree knot. She dumped thrust, dropped 2 meters, and veered hard right in a banking dip that kicked up water against the lower fuselage. The missile passed through where she'd been, tripped by her exhaust flare, and detonated harmlessly in the mud. Rotor wash slammed the inlet. Trees scraped the underside of the stabilizer. The gunner's voice stayed calm. We're not supposed to be down here. Reese's hands didn't move off the controls. Then we'd better not stay. She climbed just enough to re-clear the broken corridor and pivoted into hoverfire angle. The gunner counted out the line. 6 to cover, centering at 4 meters above inlet root spread. Ready. She let the chain gun track short bursts along the right flank. The blasts stitched bark and foliage into a haze of motion, and in that haze, the seals sprinted low and fast. One stumbled, caught a trunk for balance, then kept running. The lead pair had already reached the waterline. The inlet was flooding fast now. Saltwater lapped at the cut path like it wanted it back. In Reese's scope, she could see the corridor narrowing as the tide began reclaiming ground. The RHIBs needed to hit it now. On open comms, the boat lead called visual, clear corridor, executing approach. Reese angled again, adjusted for torque drag, and stitched a final arc of suppressive fire across the farthest outcropping where muzzle flash lit up the shadow of a downed palm. Her chain gun sweep timed with the RHIB's entry, roaring low through the salt foam and tree mist. One of the pilots shouted into her mic, "That's your lane, holy hell." It worked. A second SEAL team cut from the left bank and splashed directly into the rising current. Reese turned her heading without climbing. The Apache stayed level with the canopy. Her gunner blinked once, then exhaled. We're at -3 meters on corridor visibility. Another 60 seconds and it'll choke. Then we stay 30, Reese replied. A third heat bloom pinged on the northern slope. Gunfire sparked upward. The Apache took a glancing shot against the lower tail boom, but nothing critical. Reese shifted position with a lateral yaw flick that sent the next burst wide. Her gunner returned fire with a double tap that silenced the ridge. In the water, The RHIBs throttled back just enough to collect the last 4 SEALs still moving through the corridor. One turned mid-sprint, looked up, and saw the hovering gunship. He didn't raise a fist. He just nodded once and dove into the side hold. The radio chatter from TOC was chaotic, half delayed, filled with crosstalk and repeat commands, but none of it touched Reese. She climbed back toward holding altitude. Her arms ached. Her boots were wet. It didn't matter. The inlet behind them was already closing like it had never been cut at all. They weren't improvising. They were executing. The inlet boiled in their wake. 2 RHIBs burst through the narrow breach, hulls gliding over the shallows with the throttle fully open. The corridor Reese cut still smoked, blackened trunks jutting out. The tide had risen another foot, swallowing half the bank. But the lane held barely. One of the SEALs turned mid-sprint, half glancing over his shoulder before diving into the forward RHIB. Another stumbled knee-deep in muck, was pulled up by a teammate, and then sprinted the last few steps into the water. Gunfire cracked from the left tree line. The gunner tracked the muzzle flashes through the haze, calmly marking the reticle. Ambush, shoreline 2 clicks out, elevation gain on rocks above the mouth. Reese didn't acknowledge. She climbed for line of sight. The Apache cleared the last mangrove outgrowth and gained just enough sky to see the mouth open into salt surf. Then she fired. The chain gun walked fire across the sniper's roost, tight and controlled. Stone and bark scattered as the bursts rolled, driving the enemy squad back before they could lock aim. The final RHIB surged forward through the turbulence, catching a broad wave from the undertow and slapping down hard as it powered through the gap. In the command tent, voices overlapped in surprise. "Who authorized that fire line?" a watch officer said. Someone behind him said, "Reese did." On the gun deck of one of the lead vessels, a petty officer held binoculars to his face, watching as the Apache came into view, blades chewing open the mist above the corridor. "No one else would have tried that shot," he said quietly, almost like a confession. Inside the cockpit, Reese shifted across the pedals and pulled the nose slightly right. Her gunner stayed calm. IR clean. No return above the ridgeline. Ribs are 30 seconds to offshore merge. Below, the inlet flashed with a last streak of gunfire as a dismounted fighter rose from the bank. Before he could shoulder his launcher, Reese fired a final burst. The man vanished into spray. Silence settled after that. Not absence of sound, but a dense weight over the water. The Apache hovered long enough for one look before vanishing into surf. A few SEALs leaned over the sides, soaked and bleeding and wide-eyed. One raised a single hand, palm out, and tapped twice against the railing. No one in the cockpit acknowledged it. They had already turned back toward the inlet. From above, the corridor Reese carved no longer looked surgical. It looked inevitable, like it had always been there, waiting for someone to trace it open. Smoke marked the line. Water filled the rest. The TOC comms had settled into silence again. Orders had stopped. Even the chatter on the RHIB frequency held still for a breath. Her gunner watched the inlet on the return pass. "You know they're going to ask how you saw that gap." Reese didn't answer. She reset the targeting screen to stand by. The Apache swept low over the bend. Burnt treetops swayed beneath them, and steam rose from the blast line like breath. Below, the inlet narrowed as the tide returned. It had maybe 10 more minutes before the path vanished completely. On the forward deck of the last command RHIB, a SEAL crouched beside the pilot's console, one hand braced on the comm box, still watching the smoke fade. He said it quietly. "Whoever flew that bird just saved our team." No one responded. No praise. No ceremony. Just a long, quiet stillness inside every headset that had just heard the same outcome. The Apache held course. Reese flew back toward the forward zone. The inlet, once a dead end, now stretched open like a drawn breath long enough. Her fire path had traced through 3 canopy bands, each adjusted for drift and elevation change. The watch captain stared at the feed. "What do you mean she mapped it herself?" A voice at the back, older, quieter, answered without inflection. "I mean she read the water, not the overlays. She flew it like the tide was her clock." Reese trimmed blade pitch to reduce vibration. She flexed her glove and returned to throttle. Her boots were wet. It didn't matter. The gunner said, "You flew that like it wasn't combat, like it was timing." She didn't nod. Her eyes stayed on the water, calm in their wake. From one of the RHIBs, a call came in. "We're clear. All accounted for. No casualties on exit." TOC repeated it. "Extraction successful. All SEALs aboard. Final boat clear." No one said her name, but they all saw the corridor. The silence after the final report lasted longer than the gunfire. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Everyone saw what doctrine never planned. She nodded. Didn't need to. Spray behind like smoke. The corridor remained. Not lit. Not marked. Just open. It wasn't improvisation. It was fluency, the kind no manual could teach. The sky stayed open. The pad was still hot when she landed. Heat shimmered off the Apache's exhaust panels in visible waves, and the air around the tail boom smelled of scorched residue and salt. Reese powered down the systems one switch at a time. The HUD went black. The blade wine dropped pitch. Only the engine casing ticked as it cooled. No one said anything over the radio. But when she stepped down from the ladder, people were watching. Not staring. Watching. Stiff nods replaced the silence that had followed her all morning. The same pilots who had ignored her pre-brief now looked away when she passed. Then looked back once more. The SEAL team had already offloaded, damp and streaked with grime, moving in disciplined formation despite the adrenaline. Their team lead, still soaked to the knees, stopped halfway to the TOC tent. He pointed once, not at her, but toward the pad. "That bird saved us." No one corrected him. Reese didn't pause. She walked straight to the maintenance bay and opened the side access panel on the Apache. The exterior was streaked with dried salt and thin soot trails along the intake housings. She unclipped her gloves from her belt, pulled them on slowly, and checked the underwing latches. She moved by sequence, not mood. Her flight suit clung to her back, soaked straight through. The gunner stayed by the steps, fielding quiet questions from a junior officer who had barely looked up from his tablet during the morning's briefing. She fired into a mangrove corridor. The gunner nodded once, threaded it through elevation bands. 3 missiles cleared the lane. Chain fire held back the ridge teams. The officer looked back at the now quiet sky. How did she time that? "I just read targets." The gunner said. She read the whole field. Someone else nearby, another pilot, older, spoke low to no one in particular. She saw what we didn't. Inside the TOC, the comm staff were replaying the footage in clipped loops. No one muted it. No one cut the feed. The moment where the corridor appeared. Then the fire rippled across the ridge. Then the SEALs broke through, ran, disappeared into the RHIBs. The sequence played again, slower the second time. Back on the pad. Reese wiped down the cockpit with a clean rag and unsnapped her kneeboard. She didn't mark the map. It was already done. The ink had held even through the climb and the vibration. She folded it in thirds and slid it into her flight bag. She removed her gloves, dust-streaked and wet, and clipped them back onto her belt. A mechanic passed by, one of the junior crew who had once muttered that Apaches were too loud, too heavy, overkill for coastal runs. He didn't speak, just stopped a moment too long, eyes lingering on the side panel, the heat discoloration on the rotor housing. The bits of mangrove still stuck to the tail boom. Then he nodded once and walked off. No one offered Reese a debrief in the TOC. No one handed her a form or spoke her rank out loud. But her name passed between comm stations in the half-voiced shorthand reserved for mission leads. One operator leaned back in his chair and said it flat. Reese ran the whole inlet. No one laughed. They just kept watching the playback. Outside, the gunner stood next to the Apache for another few minutes, arms crossed, his own uniform still streaked from the low flight. A different officer tried to approach him with a clipboard, but he waved it off. "You want to know what happened?" he said. "Ask the water." As she passed the row of parked fuel carts, a crew chief standing by the shade canopy gave her a quiet once-over. He didn't speak, but when another tech asked what happened up there, He answered without looking away. She flies like the water's hers. Reese didn't turn. The line stuck behind her like vapor trail. She zipped up the side pouch of her flight bag and closed the last panel. She gave the tail boom a final visual sweep, then stepped back from the pad. The sun was angled lower now, late afternoon haze turning the pad a pale gold. Her boots left marks in the grit. No one called out to her. No one needed to. She walked toward the outer edge of the zone, alone with the wind and the hum of equipment. Her braid hung against her shoulder. Her flight suit clung damp against her legs. Her expression didn't change. No one clapped. They just watched her walk. No ceremony, no citation, just air and silence. Behind her, nothing moved. The Apache cooled in silence. Its panels glowed faintly under the work lights, soft amber reflections tracing the edge of the fuselage where the heat hadn't yet faded. A few insects buzzed against the wire fence beyond the pad. Somewhere farther off, a generator hummed low, constant as breath. Reese sat on the edge of the concrete, knees bent, boots flat to the ground, her back resting lightly against the Apache's side. The hull was still warm beneath her flight suit. She didn't move. The sky overhead was clean. The haze had burned off. Starlight traced the inlet in silver filaments, quiet and wide. The same path she'd carved hours ago had vanished beneath the tide. From up high, there'd be no sign of it now. But she remembered. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out the folded terrain map. The edges were wrinkled from sweat and handling, but the ink had held. Her notes layered over the printed grid in black pen and pencil hash. She flattened the page across her thigh, then pulled a second pen from her sleeve and began sketching. She drew the corridor first, not by measurement, but by instinct angle, shape, the slight bend where the trunks had collapsed inward. She marked the line through the mangrove density with a clean slash, then drew the arc of treefall from the hellfire radius. Beneath it, she noted a single number, 3.2 meters at peak tide. She circled it, not for review, just to remember. The metal at her back ticked once. In the silence, her memory drifted, not to the mission, not to the talk or the footage or the startled voices when her name was finally spoken aloud. It drifted to something quieter. She was maybe 10, barefoot on a flatboat with her grandfather. The waters had risen fast that year, soaking over the levee and dragging rope from the post lines. The boat skidded across flooded ditches that had once been driveways. The air smelled like copper and pine bark, and the distant breath of rain. She remembered the oars, hand-carved and smoothed to a gloss, slicing the water without sound. Her grandfather didn't talk much, but that day he said something, his voice low, roughened with age and river wind. Timing isn't skill, it's rhythm. He had pointed to the edge of a fence submerged halfway. You fight the water, it throws you. You read it, it brings you home. She hadn't answered. Just watched the current ripple around the boat as they drifted toward the road that no longer looked like a road. Back on the pad, Reese tapped the pen once against her thigh. The map was in her lap, the circle marked, the line sketched clean. The night had settled thick around them, heavy but not harsh. It wasn't cold. Still, Reese let the quiet fill her without pushing it away. The kind of quiet she'd only known a few times in her life, and always near water. She looked at the inlet's dark outline in the distance. From here, she couldn't see the breach, but she knew exactly where it had been, knew the timing of the tide to the minute, knew how far the RHIBs had pushed through before the final tree line bent. It wasn't guessing. It was rhythm, layered from years of listening. Her grandfather used to trace his fingers across flood charts the same way, not to teach or prove anything, just to understand what the water needed before it took too much. He never used a stopwatch. He used drift, wind, and how long it took for a fishing line to swing west after a boat passed upriver. Reese had watched him once time an entire launch off a bend by watching the leaves on the surface. She didn't remember the words as much as the gestures, the way he moved slow around the ropes, The way he'd say, "Sketch it once, fly it forever," even though they didn't fly anything but riverbanks. The mug warmed her hands now, the chipped ceramic pressed into her glove prints. She rested it beside her boot and watched the map light fade in the cockpit as the systems timed out. The gunner approached without sound. He held 2 mugs. One of them was hers, chipped near the handle from an old drop. He didn't speak, just lowered himself beside her, handed it over, and leaned his shoulder against the Apache, their postures near mirrored. She took a sip, let the heat settle. No words passed, none needed. The generator hummed, the starlight reflected in the puddles by the refuel line. Inside the cockpit, a single light glowed behind the glass, soft, amber, unread. She folded the map once, then twice, then tucked it behind the kneeboard panel inside the open side hatch. It fit without effort, like it had always been meant to live there. Her head came to rest against the Apache's frame. The metal didn't speak, but it held the memory. So did she. Her eyes stayed open, not waiting, just remembering. The inlet would rise again, she knew when. Just enough,